Hello, everybody, and welcome to the very first webinar sponsored by AMRC, the Association of Multisite Research Centers. We're a new organization. Today's seminar is regarding the operational inefficiencies in clinical research today and what is the true cost to the industry, as well as obviously to the healthcare system. We have some fantastic panelists who I'll introduce in a minute, but I thought perhaps first it would make sense to go through and give you a little bit of background about AMRC. We literally launched the organization about a week ago. We've been working on this for quite some time, but we brought it out to the public to make people aware of who we are, what we're doing, and why we're doing it. So if I could, on the first slide introducing AMRC, we're a new trade association. We're a not-for-profit dedicated to advancing multiple site clinical research organizations, and I'm sure you're familiar with them. We're using the acronym MCRCs, Multisite Clinical Research Centers, because there are so many inefficiencies in clinical trials, which I'm sure you're all well aware of, that these organizations can help address. So we're engaging with external stakeholders, including sponsors, CROs, other types of advocates, patient advocates, regulatory, to help them understand what MCRCs are and helps show what the things are that MCRCs can do to help deal with these inefficiencies in the industry. So the next slide, the things that we're trying to solve, number one, are some of these key industry challenges. We're all familiar with these. There are so many operational inefficiencies in the system today. Those lead to so many different problems, not the least of which is workforce burnout. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. You know, we're all familiar with the one and done phenomena, not to mention the demand on site monitors, study coordinators, PIs, of course. So that's an area where we feel like MCRCs can help. And then with the increased complexity of protocols that's been going on for years now, as well as the fragmented systems that we work within, and the new systems around data management and other technology systems, again, these things are meant to help, of course, but in some regards, they can create inefficiencies, particularly at the site level. So what do we stand for as far as solutions, or what are we advocating? One is data integrity and compliance. The other is streamlining collaboration for CROs and sponsors. In other words, working with them to help get the interface between sites and CROs and sponsors more streamlined, more vertically integrated if possible. And then finally, the benefits offered by MCRCs, things like scalability and consistency across the workforce, and enhanced support for PIs and other site staff. So the next slide spells out what our mission and vision is. And it's to serve as a dedicated advocate and interface between CROs, sponsors, regulatory, patients, and all of this is to ensure that they understand the unique advantages of working with these type of organizations, and of course to drive efficiencies. Our vision is that in the future, MCRCs will be seen as one of the key solutions to helping bring new therapies to patients and clinicians more effectively, more rapidly, and with better data. Next slide, please. Now, the group that we currently represent, there were 14 founding members of these type of organizations. Together, they employ nearly 400 research sites with over 7,000 staff members, of which about 980 are PIs. So it's a very large group when you put them all together. As far as the patient population, in 2024, they enrolled 84,800 patients in trials. So as an aggregated group, again, this is something that's growing in the industry that has very much impact on the industry. And now is the time to begin to leverage their abilities and help people understand why these abilities, again, add value to the industry. So again, I'd like to welcome all of you. Thank you so much. And at this point, I would like to welcome our panelists and thank them very much for being here today. Let's do introductions. Jennifer, would you like to start?
Good afternoon, Jim. I'm excited about this opportunity. My name is Jennifer Byrne, and I am the CEO of Javara. Javara is an integrated research network, and we've really been built for the purpose of serving healthcare organizations to ensure that clinical research comes directly to the point of care.
Thank you. MaryJo?
Yes, hi, I'm MaryJo Lamberti. I'm Associate Professor at Tufts University School of Medicine and also Director of Sponsored Research at Tufts DSDD, which is the Center for the Study of Drug Development. And we do many different types of benchmarking studies on the industry. We've looked across patient recruitment and retention, outsourcing, study startups, so a number of different topics within drug development, and I'm happy to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, MaryJo. Doug?
Thanks, Jim. Doug Peddicord, I'm Executive Director of ACRO. We're the trade organization of CROs and clinical technology companies. We have been in operation 22 years at this point. So I will say welcome to the world of trade organizations. I know you've been there before, Jim. I'm excited to see how this one goes.
Terrific. Thanks, Doug. I should also mention in the early communications we had about this webinar, we had planned to have David Burrow, who's the Director of the Office of Scientific Investigations at the FDA. Unfortunately, the Trump administration has put out an edict through the HHS that none of the people in that organization, which includes the FDA, are supposed to be speaking to the public at this point in time. We expect that that'll change over time. But unfortunately, David, as a result of that, could not be here today. The good news is we did get an opportunity to talk with him before that edict came down, and we have some information that perhaps we can share in terms of what some of his opinions appeared to be. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started. By the way, I should mention to all the attendees, please feel free to submit questions via the chat room, which we will address. The last 15 minutes of the webinar today, we want to answer your questions. So please submit them at any time. You don't have to wait till the end. You can put them into the system as we go through the meeting today. So Jennifer, we're talking about inefficiencies, right, in this webinar. What do you think are some of the specific inefficiencies at the site level that can most significantly impact sponsors and CROs? And what is it about multi-site, MCRCs that can help address some of those inefficiencies?
Okay, let's see. Where to even begin with this one, Jim? Let's just say there's plenty of opportunities ahead of us. I believe that just generally speaking, lack of standardization, whether that is external lack of standardization coming from our own sponsors and CROs, but even internal, just the technology enablement, best practices, how we are adapting to, local workflows, create, I think, a ton of inefficiencies and rework. I did want to say too, I should have said this in my introduction, Javara is one of the very proud founding members of this organization. And what I was really heartened about as we came together really for the first time almost exactly a year ago around this concept was the amount of energy from this group and others around how we really do address this inefficiency. I don't believe that anybody who has committed their career in clinical research is reinforced positively by rework. And I think, lack of standardization leads to a tremendous amount of rework. And you captured those in your opening statement, I think, quite well in terms of kind of the why behind this, whether it's workforce, whether it is, the complexity of trials, so forth and so on. I think just one to narrow in and to be very, very specific around this lack of standardization. I do believe that, there is a specific area around lack of reliability as well. And so if you think about the whole continuum of basically prospecting for a trial, how do you really match that right trial to the right patient at the right time? And all that goes into that, there's so many changes. I like to think of this business more akin to a general contractor with change orders. And, and then there are conditions that are within our control, and then there are a lot of conditions that are beyond our control. And so I think as an organization, as a collective, voice, how do we really think about, bringing that predictability and that reliability and, working together and trying to solve some of these problems around variability.
Yeah, and you're primarily talking about variability at the site level, Jennifer. Yeah, it's interesting because I remember when I was at Eli Lilly, we started delving into Six Sigma, and one of the key takeaways I got from that experience was the more variability you have, the more likely you are to have lower quality. And so this idea of standardization really does help drive towards quality as well as other types of efficiencies. Doug, I'm curious from your perspective, what are the things that happen at the site level that really impact CROs? Again, the costs of these inefficiencies, redundant activities, things of that nature. What's your take on that?
Well, let me play off of Jennifer's comments in regard to standards and standardization. I think in lots of ways the promise of MCRCs is the ability to operate at scale. And today, we largely don't operate at scale. We operate at a sort of one-off kind of relationship between sponsor CROs and research sites. And if you think about some of the operational inefficiencies that slow down trials, you think of things like contracting. You think of technology deployment, you think of site qualification, you think of recruitment avenues for patients, et cetera. And today, there's an awful lot of one by one addressing those issues and one by one taking the time to do those things that are necessary to get a trial up and running and off the ground. Again, for me, the promise is that with standardization and the ability to operate at scale, you can simply, sort of reduce by a considerable amount, I think, at least some of those operational inefficiencies, which have existed, frankly, forever at this point.
Great point. Great point. MaryJo, I know Tufts has done an awful lot of work looking at operations and gathering data and looking at areas that we can potentially improve as an industry. What are your thoughts based around this question?
Sure. Well, patient recruitment and retention has been a challenge over the years. We're also seeing the budgeting and contracting process is continually a thorn in the sides of starting up in terms of sites, getting them up and running. Adequate budgets as well for a study. I mean, a lot of times there just aren't enough, for example, payment for screen failures and so forth. So operating budgets are very important to keep a site running. And then the workforce, I know that was mentioned, ensuring that we have qualified CRAs and other site staff and to try to reduce turnover because that's been an issue over the years as well.
Yeah, Jennifer, I'm kind of curious that whole question of turnover. I've heard from many sites that when the site monitors turn over, it always creates a problem at the site level because different site monitors have different opinions, and maybe you can share a little bit more about that.
Well, that's been an age-old, challenge, and I'm not just going to pin it on, CRAs. I think within the, clinical workforce, there are issues to be addressed as well. But yes, it is a costly problem. I think that from an MRC standpoint, some of the benefit around addressing turnover, it is something that from kind of the larger networks, many of us now have our own version of project management. I've been in the site business my entire career, and that would have been such a foreign concept in the site world that we would have our own project management, because we're project managed all the time, indirectly, perhaps through with the sponsor and a CRO. But to that point, even just streamlining communications and easing some of these people transitions, we have a much better bird's eye view if we have individual staff changes, CRAs, across our own network, and the ability to share information and some of those learnings, and bringing that together. So I think that's a real area of progress. And I think some of the change, and we come to the table with clients all the time, and they're like, "What do you mean you have a project? Oh, so you're a CRO?" It's like, no. What we're really trying to do is really try to harness information, and again around that standardization and what is the kind of reliable source of truth, and ensuring too that the workforce, whether it is from the CRA standpoint or our own clinical teams, can kind of tether back to, again, central resources in terms of real-time information share and historical information.
Yeah, that's interesting. So is it fair to say that because you're dedicated to doing clinical research, your employees are not balancing a clinical practice as well, that it kind of reduces some of the risk that you deal with as it relates to managing those personnel? Because the business model of clinical compared to the business model of clinical research are so different from one another. MaryJo, have you guys looked into that at all at Tufts in terms of the comparison between fully dedicated versus what I'll call part-time researchers? I know that's probably the wrong way to put it, but people who do both clinical research and clinical practice. Have you looked into that?
Yeah, we've done some work, and we've found that the ones who are trying to juggle too many balls just end up not working again as a clinical investigator. So it puts more burden on that site and investigator, and they just don't continue with clinical research. As you know, we've done some work that shows that a lot of investigators just do one study and then they're finished, So that's a problem with the number of clinical trials that are growing, over time as well.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, back when I was at ACRP, one of the things that we determined was that the amount of trial work that is in the marketplace compared to the growth of the number of people who are doing clinical research, there was a huge exponential growth in the number of studies, but just a linear growth in the number of sites and personnel, which of course creates huge problems. Doug, I'm curious from your perspective, how does that affect CROs, do you think?
So, well, I was thinking that what do CROs and sponsors constantly look for in terms of sites? And what they look for are people that are well-trained and that have a lot of experience. It's the huge part of the wastefulness of the one and done phenomenon, is that, that site puts lots of time and effort into training itself or being trained, does one study and departs the field. Again, I think the promise of MCRCs is to think about sites that are really dedicated to research and operate at scale, and that have a lot of experience because they operate at scale. The more that you operate at some scale, now your body of experience in a given year might not be 8 or 10 studies across your sites. It might be 60 or 70 studies. I mean, it's really exponentially greater. And I think that means that the folks running those trials have simply much more experience, which is, in our field, it's the more you've done, the better you are. And so I think that should be a factor that's being addressed, I hope.
Well, from a regulatory, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry, if I could just add to that point, Doug, I think the opportunity is that the role and the function of the clinical team becomes so much more defined. And, in the MCRCs, we have the scale opportunity where we are centralizing what, might be an administrative function for so many people with that same job title, a CRC, or in our case, we call them clinical trial navigators. And so, with that kind of focus and honing comes obviously just expertise. It's the rule of 10,000. You just have that repetition, and the job itself is so less variable in terms of all the additional, perhaps administrative task. And there's just so much variability in the workforce, and is a coordinator also responsible for regulatory submissions, for example. So I think that, as we are scaling, we are seeing the need to use the workforce and ensure these people are put to the highest level of, their skill set.
So it's almost, Jennifer, moving from a jack of all trades type of a role and responsibility to become more of a master of a specific element of conducting that trial, which to me kind of brings up another one of the questions that I think is interesting. I know we can't speak on behalf of David, but it'd be interesting to get your all perspectives on how you think regulatory is going to look at this in terms of improvement of quality of the data that's submitted. Doug, I'm curious your thoughts on that one.
Thanks, Jim, because I was thinking that data quality, the regulator cares about patient safety and data quality. Mm-hmm. That's their job. We in some ways have to care about all of the things that contribute to those two factors. But thinking about data quality, again, I go back to the question of standardization, because one of the things that's most challenging now is that in operating multi-site research, sponsor or CRO faces the task of combining data from a lot of different sources. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that has always been a high cost, I don't know that I would call it, an inefficiency, but it's always been a high cost, is just this whole notion of data cleaning. Sort of the notion that there are varying levels of quality, and that therefore you have to sort of spend a lot of time rechecking and cleaning data. And I think, again, one would hope that in a more integrated kind of research organization, that across studies, and certainly within the same study, the data collection will be the same. The data entry will be the same. The technology used will be the same. And so therefore, you're kind of addressing at least a piece of the data quality problem there. So my thought is that it relates very much to the question of what FDA or any other regulator really cares about, which is, can you trust the data?
Yeah, great point. You made me stop and think about protocol amendments too, because, quality sometimes obviously happens at the site level, but there are also things where as a study is ongoing, we learn that there's something that we need to modify in that protocol. MaryJo, your thoughts? I mean, I know that you guys have been tracking the increase in protocol amendments and things like that. Do you think that there's some data, number one, to support, what's going on with that? Has it changed? And then my second question would be, does it make sense that if there is a protocol amendment, it's easier to implement across a MCRC as opposed to perhaps the traditional approach?
I think, it's true. There are many protocol amendments. Now we're seeing that in terms of protocol amendments, 75% of protocols require at least one substantial amendment. As you know, protocol amendments are associated with larger and more complex trials. So that also contributes to what Doug was saying in terms of data. Phase 3 trials collect an average 3 times more data compared to 10 years ago, and that there are about 3.5 million data points for a phase 3 trial, for a pivotal trial supporting new drug approval. So that really plays into the fact that we need to deal with that, as well as we're seeing substantial increases in enrollment duration and dropout rates. So any way of standardizing ways to respond to this would be positive, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I'm trying to get back to the economic impact of all this too. What are we seeing in terms of the cost of trials? Are we seeing increases in that area as well as a result of these things?
Yeah, Tufts has recently looked at the cost of a delay day, and one of our economists works on the cost it takes to develop drugs, and we found that the average daily direct cost for phase 3 clinical trials is nearly $56,000, and that a mean direct cost of a delay day for late-stage clinical trials is $40,500 on average. So that's just in one day of delay.
Now, just so I'm clear, is that in future revenue or is that in actual out-of-pocket expenses to conduct the trial?
That's in actual expenses that it costs to conduct the trial. We're seeing that the top losses are in respiratory and immunology for some reason, and we haven't investigated that yet.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
Can I add on to this? And MaryJo, correct me if I'm wrong, but is your data in terms of the cost to pharma, that does not include the cost to the site ecosystem?
Right, exactly. That's a good point, Jennifer.
So you can compound that, because I can tell you, if you really talk about inefficiencies, a tremendous business challenge for those of us that, are on the side of, the last mile of enrolling these patients. The unreliability that's coming with this causes us to have stranded resources. So back to that professionalized workforce, we have seen a tremendous uptick, especially in the last couple of years, not only in terms of just trial delays, but now we're seeing supply chain issues. Like, we are actually building into our forecasting now. When we're looking at our financial forecasting, we are using data now, real time and some historical data, to start making predictions in terms of our resource, utilization based on some of these delays. So it's a compounded number that, probably is, I don't know that it's on scale, but it could actually be even more cost to that, to the trial site landscape.
Right.
Very interesting. MaryJo, I'm curious if you have any data, or even if it's anecdotal, do we see that most sites are doing that type of resource planning, or do you think that's a phenomena that we're seeing primarily with the larger groups?
Yeah, I don't know. We haven't really looked at that, but I think it does. It varies by site size. I'm sure the larger, like the academic sites, probably can do that versus the smaller ones that you mentioned earlier. So yeah, that's something we could look at in future studies, though.
Great. Yeah, something to think about. So, Doug, I'm curious, why do you think that CROs and sponsors are somewhat reluctant to move out of the old traditional model of site selection and move more towards the utilization of MCRCs? Because it seems to me like if you've got to negotiate a budget.
What makes you say they're reluctant, Jim?
I'm just assuming they are. Maybe I'm wrong, because we're talking about a shift in the industry.
Certainly, some of them have been buying those kinds of organizations. So I might assume that at least for some of them, they see a positive advantage too.
Okay, and do sponsors go along with that?
Well, I don't know whether you mean, do sponsors similarly go along with the idea of, I think they should, but I don't know what'll drive sponsor behavior. I do think, though, if the choice is between doing contracting with 50 separate research sites on the same protocol versus doing contracting with 2 or 3 larger organizations that can provide a lot of sites, I actually think the efficiency that's offered by that will be pretty compelling for CROs and sponsors.
Yeah, well, to me that makes sense, but I've also been in this business a long time and seen some different changes, things that make a lot of sense, and it takes a long time for them to be implemented.
Well, if you're
EDC is
talking,
probably
if it, I mean, if you're talking about, is it hard for people to change their behaviors? The answer to that is always yes.
yes.
And certainly, there will always be, preferences for certain sites and certain individual sites and all those kinds of things. I don't think we're gonna do away with the variability in the enterprise overall. But if we can reduce the variability by a little bit in a couple of areas, then I think that's promising.
Yeah, yeah. Jennifer, what's your take on that?
Listen, I think this all drives eventually for great change because, in a larger scale, multi-site research, corporation, you largely, and we are seeing more evidence of kind of, in a way, a bigger commitment and a bigger buy. Very few trials that we see are all those eggs put in one basket. But many trials that we are seeing that, 2 or 3 or 4 larger, organizations are being solely sourced. I think the good thing that comes out of this is that you are only as good as your weakest link. So around that consistent delivery, and if you are coming to the table and you are being, you have 20 of your sites that are included, we are seeing much more rigor in governance and expectations around that consistent delivery.
Good, good. MaryJo, are you all seeing anything at Tufts about site selection and how it's been altered over the past decade or so?
We're seeing the use of new technologies. Certainly the use of AI and machine learning is starting to be used to make site selection quicker and more accurate. So that's definitely a change. And there are organizations taking that up and implementing that. So I think that you'll see more of a positive shift in the future, especially in other areas of clinical trial execution as well. So I think technology is playing a big role now.
Good, good. So Jennifer, another question for you is in regards to some of the unique challenges then that MCRCs face, and what are some of the things that we can do through AMRC in order to address those challenges?
Well, I mean, I think an age-old challenge is through, these larger organizations, as we evolve and as we scale, you don't start with being all things to all people. You start with specific therapeutic focus, and over time, that ability to be able to expand and diversify across not only geographic areas, and patient populations that are served, but the therapeutic areas. And I think that's where there's a tremendous amount of opportunity, because we're still facing the, resistance for inclusion in new investigators, new site locations, in the absence of experience. So in a way, the larger organization, I think, can provide some additional resources and talent and expertise, around that. But I think that there's just another great opportunity for us to be working together, that if you have the infrastructure and you have the know-how and you have the talent, how do you start to really, again, branch into new therapeutic areas? And there are different complexities and variables that come with that, but how can we accelerate that expansion across consistent delivery in, especially what I'm going to say, the non-vaccine therapeutic areas. So that's one area in particular. Okay,
great. Hey, Doug, I'm gonna.
So Jim, I'm gonna, mention one thing. Your assumption was maybe sponsors and CROs are going to be resistant to changing the way they have at least traditionally done business. I do think one thing that I would encourage AMRC to do as a group is to begin looking at developing metrics around performance. Because I think while I talk a lot about obviously the promise of standards and operating at scale, I think what's going to move sponsors and CROs is if you can develop some metrics around the performance of AMRC members that says, gee, if you contract with 100 sites, on average, it's going to take you 7 months to contract with those. But by the way, if you use our membership, it might take you 3.5 months or 4 months or whatever it is. I mean, I think it would behoove you, not that you have to, but it would behoove you to think about the audience that you're interested in convincing as having a lot to do with CROs and sponsors at this point.
Yeah, great, excellent point, Doug. And the truth is we're having some difficulty finding some of that data currently, but that's something that we definitely want to pursue. MaryJo, do you have any thoughts on that in terms of what might currently be available that we could use as baseline and then measure going forward?
Yeah. Another area I was thinking about was vendor qualification, because we've done studies on that and found that can lead into millions of dollars and months of time just having to qualify a vendor. So I think that you could play a role in that and show that you could do that in a more standard way, a more rapid way. And you'll have some of the areas that, that could be measured as well, because we've looked at that. You could take those areas and look at those. Like, for example, we looked at IT support, training, data privacy protection, R&D ethics. So anything in which you would use to evaluate, a vendor or some partner that you'd be working with, I think is important to show you could get things done faster.
What about things that Doug was referring to, like contracting and study startup?
Yeah, we've looked at study startup, and we have looked at that in regards to using repeat sites and new sites. And in all ways, it's faster with using repeat sites for sponsors and CROs to use repeat sites. So there, startup times where there was a pretty appreciable difference. We haven't updated that data, but it's not that old, so I'm sure you can play off of that. So that is something you want to look at.
Okay.
As well.
And on the back end, things like data queries, things of that nature, do we have data surrounding those type of things?
Well,
or quality type of things? Or?
Yeah, we've done a study of risk-based monitoring and risk-based quality management that was just published last year. So that would be something to look at, especially with ICH, E2R3. That's a big impact on sponsors as well. And we were finding, though, that only a little over half were using risk-based monitoring. So I don't know if it's the expense or, the use of technology or many other areas come into play in that. But I think that's important as well, in doing this type of metrics.
Great. Jennifer, thoughts on the metrics?
Yeah, I think having through this consortium in particular, standardizing, and Jim, I think we've even had some discussions within our own membership about the opportunity that we have in terms of just standardizing what really are the key metrics, what are the metrics that matter, and how are we more consistently sharing those measures and defining those. So again, it goes back to standardization and sharing this information that we're, all speaking the same language. Because I think sometimes what constitutes startup in a timeline and putting a metric to it, there are a lot of definitions in terms of what does that actually mean. We not so long ago, just from a business standpoint, we really had one definition around how we defined pipeline, and it was pretty broad. And now, we're much more defined in terms of what are those metrics that actually give us a clearer view in terms of projecting time to first enroll the patient. And from a site standpoint, that is very, very important because you're thinking about the timing of outreach to patients. You're thinking about the timing of having your study team queued up. So just standardization around some of these basic terms, is I think something that is greatly needed. And quite honestly, on the site side of things, that's something we need to be driving that. That's less of a CRO or sponsor, I think, agenda.
That's a great point, Jennifer. Actually, it takes me back to, again, my sponsor days when we were first starting to look at metrics across various sponsors through a blinded market research firm. And the metrics that were used from sponsor to sponsor were completely different. And the biggest challenge was really getting everybody aligned in terms of what is first patient in, or what is protocol approval, or what is data lock, et cetera. It's a really good point that you bring forward. Hey, I just want to remind the audience that please submit questions. We're going to start going to your questions here in a moment. But before we do that, Doug, I have one more for you. Since you were there at the very beginning of ACRO, and maybe this is some advice for me personally, but as you were starting the organization, I know you and I have talked, and you mentioned to me before this importance of metrics. But what are some of the things you think that have happened in the industry over the past 22 years that have evolved the CRO market? And I'm not asking you to predict the future, but where might we expect MCRCs to go going forward?
Well, I don't know about predicting yet. But I will say that one of the things that at the company level, I think what's interesting about this kind of organization is you've sort of got a team of rivals. I mean, you've got a team of competitors, because these are companies that will, in many ways, compete for business in a marketplace. I think what certainly was interesting with the companies of ACRO was that they were able to, within the context of their trade organization, the interest was in advancing the industry and the enterprise. Within the context of business, their interest was in beating each other out. I mean, that was, they remain, it's a competitive marketplace. So I think that was something they did extremely well. I'm really very happy that they were able to do that. So that's kind of issue one. I think you have to be, in some ways, devoted to the notion that you're trying to advance a better way of doing things, not just your own company. You'll be interested in advancing your own company within your business, but within the context of the association, you're interested in advancing your part of the enterprise and the enterprise overall. And I think that's really something that comes from the allying with each other on making the enterprise something that's better, and it's better for sites, and it's better for patients, and it gets better at what it does. And I think that's one thing I think the companies of ACRO, or at least how the enterprise has evolved, it's gotten more complex. And in lots of ways, it's significantly better than it was. So I think I recognize both that it's harder to do and it's better at what it does. And if you look at things like vaccine development, I mean, obviously, COVID was an amazing test for our enterprise, for our industry, and for the enterprise overall. And we all did amazingly well. So we're capable of great things. I think that's I would keep that in mind.
That's great. Thanks, Doug. And indeed, that's exactly what we're trying to do, is to improve the overall enterprise through the utilization of these types of tools and organizations. So thanks for that. I appreciate it. Okay, I'm going to turn to some of the questions from the audience. Here's one. What do you think will be the biggest area of cost savings to a sponsor that comes with working with an MCRC? Would it be vendor selection, patient recruitment, contracting, study startup, site selection, whatever? What do you think will be the biggest area of cost savings for sponsors?
Can I answer?
Jennifer? Yeah, please. I was waiting to see who goes first.
Yeah, I mean, there are plenty of opportunities in all those areas for sure. But I think the single biggest one and most important one to crack is patient recruitment. All things related, how AI can better be, how it can better, be leveraged and used in terms of more precision around, not only prospective patients, but I think even additional data that gives you insights in terms of patients who actually are going to complete the trial. So, it's the enrollment all the way through the continuum to improve ultimately completion rates.
Okay,
And
good.
and just to add to that, we've been finding that the investments required to do something like what Jennifer just mentioned is fairly high. So I'm thinking that a corporation could probably muster up the capital, both in terms of finances and human capital, to implement and adopt this type of technology, and that in the long run will be worth the investment, at least from what we're finding in our surveys that we've done of AI and ML.
Very good. Thanks, MaryJo. Here's another one. How should sites outside of AMRC, including both site networks and individual sites, think about AMRC when it comes to collaboration and working together? I'll take a first shot at that. The interesting thing about this is what we're trying to do is expand the market. In other words, there's still going to be plenty of work for everybody, right? We talked earlier about the exponential growth of studies that need to be taking place and the linear growth in terms of investigators and sites. And one of the things that the membership of AMRC believes is that, look, we're not saying only work with MCRCs. What we're suggesting is, Doug kind of touched on it earlier, if you need 50 sites, maybe you go to 2 of these organizations and you lock in 30 of them or 40 of them through 2 organizations with 2 contracts. But you still want to use other individual sites. There's a wide variety of reasons to select other types of sites besides the MCRC types of sites. So to us, it is a collaboration in terms of driving forward the industry. I think what we're hoping is that through AMRC, some of the things that the MCRCs offer will become more commonplace in terms of how people think about conducting trials, along with the traditional approach. Jennifer, you have any thoughts on beyond that?
Well, I mean, listen, I think there's a great opportunity for, all sides. I love the curiosity as probably represented by the audience that's participating in this today, like how we're learning from each other. And I think there's a tremendous opportunity for sites, whether single location, if it's a single location site, and thinking about how they're going to expand their footprint. I mean, a lot of the playbook that's being developed is really around that standardization. And how do you actually start thinking about building more towards kind of an enterprise approach? And what it would be the tools, for example, what would be a CTMS that you would use that would be more relevant to, multi-sites or multi-centers versus single center? And there are differences in terms of those, tools. So, yeah, I think there's, we're going to have a responsibility as an organization, I think, to take our learning and, to share and to, as Doug said, the call to action to make it better.
Right. Thank you. Here's another one. It says sponsors are increasingly outsourcing to CROs. When data management, monitoring, and site selection are all conducted by different CROs on the same trial, how will that impact sponsor and CRO's ability to connect performance, quality, and site selection decisions? What advantages do MCRCs provide here? Actually, I'm a little curious about that one because my experience is that, and I get people do this with FSP sometimes, but I've not seen too many studies, and Doug, correct me if I'm wrong on this, MaryJo, where you're using multiple CROs on the same study for different roles and responsibilities. Am I off base there?
I think it depends on the company. We've seen that, and it makes it harder to manage and create oversight. But maybe with standards, standardizations for your organization, that might help. But that is an issue. Communication would be another issue as well that we've seen. So I don't know if Doug can add to that or.
Yeah, not really. I think we, as you said, MaryJo, it depends a lot on sponsor, and the notion of that's kind of taking FSP to a real end point, which is dividing up functions that much. So if you get 3 or 4 CROs, that's a lot of people trying to manage differing functions. So. Yeah. While it happens, I don't think it's that common a model, and I think it in some ways makes certainly the notion of standardization and communications much harder.
Jennifer, have you experienced that as a organization?
Somewhat. I don't know that that's the standard. But certainly does that happen, on occasion. I mean, this is a general statement, but I would say, we would prefer it not to be that way. There are enough other variables. But I do think that it does actually bring into play, kind of in our sector now, almost a need for more centralization in terms of, MaryJo kind of hit on this, a project delivery, project management orientation, where at least we're able to kind of synchronize the communications and just collaborating, kind of being almost more of a command center or air traffic controller. That's probably a better analogy.
Okay, thank you. Hey, here's an interesting one. How do you shed the image of being a quote research mill unquote? It says many old school folks in the industry are very hesitant for this model because they think it's simply a research mill that doesn't produce quality. What are your thoughts on that? You don't want to, no comment?
You want me to take that one?
Well, yeah, you can. Anybody can take that one. I mean, my personal opinion is, you go ahead, and I'll give my personal opinion later.
Well, in the Javara model in particular, I think it's a little bit different in that we're actually integrating with healthcare. So these are actually patients, and they have this is something that happens within the continuum of their care. I've heard that term, my entire career. I think it's unfair. There's no sustainability if you treat people like they're part of a mill. And I actually think that the clinical research experience in and of itself, and there's been data that's been published about this, people get better health care when they are in clinical trials. It's a higher touch. And whether that's happening in a freestanding, research site, or it is a site business that is using social media, or they're using their own database that they've built, you don't get repeat customers if you're not taking care of them, taking really good care of them, and providing good data. So I think that term is a little inflammatory.
I agree. The other piece of it too is, we kind of touched on this earlier, is if you have people who are specialists and masters or experts in conducting various roles within clinical research and working with patients or data or whatever their role happens to be, you're more likely to get better quality than if you have somebody who's doing it part-time. So I think that would be something to consider. I get why people have that image, but it also ties back to the issues we're struggling with as an industry for years and years and years, the old guinea pig phenomena, patients participating seen as guinea pigs. I can share with you that having been a clinical trial participant myself, I was very pleased with the amount of attention I got from the various functions within the organization that I was in the trial. And it was completely different from my experience as a patient in normal clinical care. It was much more thoughtful, and they spent a lot more time with me. So that's not always going to be the case, but I do think that's an important point. Well, we're down to about the last 4 minutes. Doug, would you like any closing comments from your perspective?
Yeah, I will. I will say welcome. I think one of the things I was asked was, is this somehow a competitive trade organization with ACRO? And I think the answer is really no, for a lot of reasons. I think we represent different parts of the enterprise. I also think our target, the target of people we want to convince is somewhat different. I think sponsors and CROs, and to some extent technology companies as well. I think our advocacy is aimed very much at regulators, global regulators, and to a lesser extent, the legislators who oversee and direct those regulators. My own guess is that AMRC's target, the folks you are most interested in convincing, are sponsors and CROs. I mean, I think they are the folks who are, who kind of hold the levers of where research goes. And I think that's why I say, I think if you can develop some data and some metrics, that'll be really helpful. So I think I think we have different audiences in some ways. I think we represent different parts of the enterprise. But I'm really happy to say welcome, and I think it's a collaboration that's worth it, because we do indeed spend time trying to figure out how do we best interact with other parts of the ecosystem, with sites, with IRBs, with sponsors, et cetera. So.
Well, we certainly look forward to working with you, Doug. Thank you for being here today. MaryJo?
Yeah, I know we've talked about metrics and looking at benchmarking, so I think that's something that Tufts could help with. I know we've worked with Doug in the past on some studies as well, so that may be something we can continue, after this call.
Absolutely, looking forward to it.
Yeah.
And Jennifer, closing thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, our ultimate responsibility and call to action, as far as AMRC and the impact of the work that we do, is really all things related to touching patients. And how do we do that better and more efficiently and reliably? And one thing, again, that we talked about in some of our planning meetings, Jim, with the greater membership base, is the call to action in terms of our responsibility of building community trust in the process, so that we are, I think collectively, we stand to do a much better job of erasing the narrative around guinea pig and, point the greater public in the direction that this is about empowered healthcare consumers, and clinical research is just an important choice.
Thank you, Jennifer. I totally agree. And once again, I'd like to thank our panelists. You did a terrific job. Really appreciate your time and efforts, and particularly your comments and experience. So with that, everybody, I'd like to say thank you for participating and listening in. Thank you for those of you who sent in questions. They were very good questions. And hopefully we'll see you in the future.